So, a couple of people we should mention in relation to Lakshmi's life. One is not so known. That's Dr. Narayana Reddy. He was a veterinarian who treated Lakshmi in her final days. There's a couple interesting things about his life, but just to refresh your memory where he fits in the story, if you remember, for example, in those last days of Lakshmi's life, he was the one coming. In fact, on the final day, if you remember the very final day, Bhagavan comes around 10 o'clock, lays his hands on Lakshmi, and then he goes out. Then that veterinarian comes in and gives an injection. And Nagama says that by this time Lakshmi was hardly responsive. He turns her over into like what Bhagavan calls Nandi position, and because she had a boil on her leg, and so he put some ointment on that boil. Then about 11:30, Lakshmi passed away. You'll remember that Bhagavan didn't stay till the last moments. He came only a few moments afterwards, and Nagama had asked him why you didn't stay, and he says her karmas were finished, And if you remember, when Bhagavan up at Skandashram, when he was with his mother, after she passed away, he said, there's no pollution. No pollution. And they commenced to eat. He said, there's no pollution. We can have a normal meal. Well, it was a little like that with Lakshmi, because he left before her passing away because all her predispositions were exhausted, according to Bhagavan. Bhagavan went as usual because in the dining hall, no one will commence eating without Bhagavan there. So they went, had their meal as normal. When the meal was over, he came back. Well, when he came back, he says, what, is it over? And those gathered around said yes, and everyone was a little sad. And Bhagavan went up and said, oh, Lakshmi, Lakshmi. And they told the others it was because of her that our community has grown. He said like that. And then he pointed out, he said, look, she was laying on her left side now, she was laying with her left ear up, and now she's laying with her right ear up. And it says, those who pass away in Kashi, it says, with the right ear up, Lord Shiva will speak to them in the final moments of their life. So that was a little small, role that Dr. Narayana Reddy had to play in those final moments of Lakshmi's life. But what's interesting about Dr. Narayana Reddy, he came here, he was sent by the government. He was a government veterinarian, and his professor, when he had been a student, his professor, Ananta Narayana Rao, had been associated with Chinnaswamy. And Chinnaswamy phoned Professor Ananta Narayana Rao and said, we've got this sick cow. And so he recommended this Dr. Narayana Reddy, who had been stationed here. He was the government touring veterinary surgeon, okay? So he was stationed here, an official post. He didn't know Bhagavan. He didn't know Lakshmi. He didn't know anything about really Arunachala probably. And but because of his professor's recommendation, he came under Chinnaswamy's request and cared for Lakshmi in the final days of her life. Well, the interesting thing about it was, again, he's a scientist. He had had some Theosophical Society connections, but he was not really a religious man per se. But because of Lakshmi, he found his way to Bhagavan. And by the time it came for him to receive payment from the ashram, he refused. And so Bhagavan, and Bhagavan asked him again, he'd refused Chinnaswamy payment. When Bhagavan asked him about it, he refused again. So Bhagavan asked Chinnaswamy, please give him copies of all the ashram books. At that time, there were probably not so many books, but, there's quite a few books. And that was given in lieu of payment. Well, that doctor became a devotee. And in fact, we know his grandson is still coming, even up until COVID started. So his whole family became devotees, or at least his son and his grandson were devotees. So that was one interesting point, that through Lakshmi he had come to Bhagavan and kind of became, a devotee. So much so that he was an orator, he was a good teacher, and he used his oratorical skills to lecture on Bhagavan and gave talks on Bhagavan and wrote a book on Bhagavan, which was published. So that's one interesting point, that, Lakshmi brought this government veterinarian to Bhagavan. So I found that interesting. Other interesting point about Dr. Narayana Reddy is that he lived until a very advanced age. In 2011, we interviewed him. He was 103 at that point in 2011, June. I think he passed away somewhere around 2014. We did an obituary on him. So he lived to about 106, you know, and he was very clear when we interviewed him. He was elderly, but very, very lucid, you know. So, so that's one person I wanted to mention. Now, something even more interesting, perhaps, in connection with Lakshmi's life is Kiripati. We haven't said anything about Kiripati. Most people know about Kiripati, but for those who don't, just to say a few words about her, she was here already. So we're now going way back to the beginning. When Bhagavan came, 1896, came to the temple, she was already there. She used to stay at that Subramanya shrine, and she would give food to the sadhus. I don't think she was making the food. It was Bhagavan says it was one Kamala lady who was making the food, sending the food through her, and she would distribute it. Well, Bhagavan came. He was a sadhu, another sadhu, right? And so she fed him as well. But she took to him above the other sadhus. And, of course, Bhagavan was only there some 6 months, let's say, in the temple. Then he went out to Gurumurtam, was there at Gurumurtam and the adjacent mango grove for about 2 years, I think, 18 months, I think it was. And then he moved up, eventually moved up to Virupaksha cave. Well, by this time, Kiripati was living up there in the Guhanama Shivaya temple. And she had already taken a shine to Bhagavan, and she made it her duty. See, many people, when they'll talk about the duties of devotees who offered service in respect of food, we think of Mudalayarpati, we think of Echamal, who came early on, but not quite as early as Kiripati. So from the very beginning, Kiripati was serving Bhagavan food. And she had, like Echamal and like Mudalayarpati, she had a kind of a vow that she wouldn't eat until she fed something to Bhagavan. But she was very poor. She lived on that, in that Mentapam up at Guhanama Shivaya temple, and she would collect things from the hill, from plants, leaves and kire, you know, and just whatever she could find. And then she would collect the cow dung to use as the fuel to cook with, etc. And Bhagavan said she only had one possession. That was her cooking pot, which was an old beat-up thing. She would, in the winter months, she would heat her water for her bath with that same pot, and that's how she would cook her breakfast and her food. But she wouldn't eat until she offered something to Bhagavan. And Bhagavan tells how he used to come down to Guhanama Shivaya temple sometimes and help her clean the leaves and prepare the whatever she was cooking. And then sometimes he would stay and eat with her. Like anyway, there was a long-standing relationship there. She died in 1921, and I don't really know what happened with the burial, but Bhagavan says she was buried opposite of the Dakshinamurti shrine. If you remember, this whole area was a burial ground. So the body was brought down. I don't think there was any cremation. They were all sadhus. They didn't have the money to do a cremation. She was buried opposite the Dakshinamurti shrine. And there was a shrine up until 2005, because I saw that shrine that told that that's where she was buried. But what makes her story particular to Lakshmi is that from early on, devotees who knew Kiripati and those who had only heard about her, they were convinced that Lakshmi was an incarnation of Kiripati. Now, the thing you have to, when you bring up a story like that, you have to remember that Bhagavan never said anyone was reborn from anyone else. And you remember Bhagavan said, don't put too much importance to birth and death and rebirth, because there's only the self. That's the ultimate reality. However, Bhagavan himself says in various places, you know, he talks about, like, for example, you know, that animals, we don't know, he said about the treatment of animals, whether it be birds or cows or monkeys or dogs, we don't know what soul has been reborn in this body and has come to finish off their remaining karmas. Well, in 1946, that Rani Mazumdar, there was a story, they were reading, this is before Lakshmi's passing, there was a story about, they were reading a story, and in that story, Cow Lakshmi's name came up. So she put the question to Devraj Mudaliar, you know, asking directly, look, devotees are saying that Lakshmi is the incarnation of Kiripati, and Bhagavan has nowhere denied it, you know. And part of her question was, look, if the tradition says that to be born as a human is most auspicious, there's not so much talk about an animal coming to work off karma. That's what we do as humans. That's the preferred scenario, right? According to the tradition. And so if Kiripati, a human, came and was in Bhagavan's presence, why would she need to take birth as an animal to finish off that karma? Why wouldn't that have been done already in her human form? That was the gist of the question. And then Bhagavan says something interesting. He says, well, I never said that Kiripati came back as a cow. I never said that, okay? And then Devaraj Mudaliar tells Bhagavan, yes, I've told her that, and blah, blah, blah. And she's pointing out that there's been so many people who've said it, it's been written, and Bhagavan has never refuted it, okay? Now, interestingly, that would be, Bhagavan's would be on the spot now. Like he would have to say categorically one way or the other, look, one way or the other. But no, he just says, he responds to that challenge by saying, well, people think that that you can't be born as an animal. You can't work off karma as an animal, but it's not true, And then he goes on to praise Lakshmi. Okay, so that was his answer. That's very interesting. If you'll remember, it was around this time that Madhavaswami died. He died in that same. This was September. That Rani put that question to him in September. He had died in July of that same year. And then the next year, the Maharani of Baroda presented Bhagavan with a white peacock. Everyone knows this story, but I'll just say it briefly because it's kind of relevant. And that peacock took Bhagavan, lived in the same place there in the shrine where, sat in the same place in the shrine where, sorry, not in the shrine, but in the hall where Madhava had stayed, and Madhava had been, Bhagavan's attendant, very faithful attendant. There's a lot of interesting backstory there, but we won't go into that now. And one of the things he's noticed to have done is that, Bhagavan, the ashram library was there in the hall with Bhagavan, and that peacock would go and peck at those books that Madhava had bound, And so devotees began saying that, began calling this peacock Madhavan, and Bhagavan also called him Madhavan. And I remember Annamalai Swami tells an interesting story. That peacock came over and visited him over at his hut, and he sat in the same place where Madhava used to come when he would visit. There was all these many different stories from different sides about the behavior of this peacock. And Bhagavan himself says, that the peacock was amazing because it thought it was a human being. It behaved like a human. It only moved with humans. It didn't go hang out with the peacocks, And of course, you remember that famous scene. See, even GBS was taken by the behavior of this peacock. And he wrote an ashtakam. He wrote like 8 verses praising, and in the peacock meter, by the way, in praising this bird. Well, when Bhagavan read out those verses, which he apparently really liked, he was very taken by them, Lalita Venkataraman was there, and he asked her, look, he handed her the verses, you have to sing these with your veena. She was a veena player and a singer. And so she did. I think according to GVS, within only about 30 minutes, she figured out a way to put those to music and was ready to play. Had her veena there and was ready to play. But the peacock was nowhere to be seen. He said, no, we can't sing without the hero, So he called out, Madhava, Madhava. And sure enough, from the roof of the veranda, I think at this time it was probably the Golden Jubilee Hall is where Bhagavan was living at that time. So if you remember, for Golden Jubilee, in that same year, they built a big pandal there, and Bhagavan stayed in that for a long time. So that Madhavan was up on the top of that pandal. I think this is the way we can understand the way it's written. He jumps down, she starts singing, he starts dancing. Okay? Now if it's just an ordinary peacock, how does it know that the song is about him? And how does he know this is a time to dance? So he dances. So this was really amazing for devotees. And then at the end of the 8 verses, you know, she ends the composition, beautifully done, evidently, everyone says. He goes over to the veena and pecks at the strings of the veena. And Bhagavan says, look, he wants you to do it again. So she does. She sings again. He dances again, you know. And so everyone comments, GVS comments, that, you know, it was very extraordinary behavior for an animal, for a bird, you know. So that was 1947. So this is in that same time period when this discussion of Lakshmi being the incarnation of Kiripati. So, you know, the Rani puts her question. Bhagavan kind of tries to get off. Well, I never said that Lakshmi was, that Kiripati was reborn as a cow. And so, you know, Bhagavan says, you know, many people think, it's commonly believed that that a person can't come back in the form of an animal, but it's not so. And he says, you know, in our midst, animals come into our presence, and we can't say for sure why they're here. We can't say what the journey of that Atman has been prior to this animal. You know. Then he goes on to talk about Lakshmi and talks about how extraordinary she was. And he lists off a bunch of, this comes in Day by Day in the November 46 section, so you can read it. But he goes off and kind of recounts her story and lists off her extraordinary behaviors, you know. And so again, he doesn't say unequivocally that Lakshmi is the incarnation of Kiripati, but it's very interesting that when he's up against the wall and he has to give an answer, he answers that way, you know. And finally, the other point, I don't remember in the literature this being pointed out, but it just happened to come to my attention that, and this leads us back to the beginning of our talk, is that if you'll remember, Lakshmi was born in Gudiyatam. That Arunachal Pillai lived in Gudiyatam in a little town called Kumaramangalam, just outside of Gudiyatam. Lakshmi was born there. Kiripati's from Gudiyatam, you know. So it's kind of interesting, you know. So there's so many, I mean, there's just so many accounts of Lakshmi that are extraordinary by anyone's estimation. But just one, because there's this theme about that an animal, this question about whether an animal could work off karma, and Bhagavan says definitely so. And but one scene comes to my mind, and just in relation to this conversation, and that's when you know, Lakshmi used to come to the hall regularly, or you know, many times she came to the hall and would visit Bhagavan, then come away, and presumably that door would just remain open, and she could just come in and go out as she pleased. But one time she comes in, and Bhagavan's reading the newspaper. I think it may be after lunch, but anyway, it's a quiet time. And Bhagavan's reading the newspaper there, and Lakshmi comes up, she starts licking the paper. She's not interested in the paper, she wants Bhagavan's attention, and Bhagavan's like, you know, no, not now, Lakshmi, not now. She continues, and he says, okay. He folds the paper, puts it down, puts his hands on her, begins petting her, and Shantamal says the cow just falls completely silent, completely still, and the whole room becomes still. And Bhagavan was there with his hands on her, and he looks over at Shantamal and he says, you know what Lakshmi's doing now? She's in samadhi, you know. And so, you know, this goes on for some minutes, and then finally, of course, Lakshmi leaves. But again, that's a kind of a, again, there's just so many indications of her human-like, and maybe even you can say divine-like qualities, you know. And Bhagavan didn't say she's resting or she's being still. She's in samadhi. She's in a meditation state, you know. What were the beginnings of the ashram Goshala, which actually started with Lakshmi coming as a baby calf in December of 1926. But of course, in December of 1926, there was nothing here, you know. And we have photos to prove that. Like we have photos from 1925, and we can see in one photo, I remember, there's Bhagavan's in that photo, and it's an angle shooting out from approximately where today's Nirvana room is, out towards the road. And there's no perimeter walls around the ashram, and there's no buildings in the ashram. Of course, there's no dining hall, there's no old hall, there's not even, there's no mother shrine, there's a grass structure around the mother samadhi. There's no office, there's no bookstall, there's no Goshala. And you can look out and you can see a dirt road going in front of Ramana Ashram. And in that one photo, there's a bullock cart going down. So you can see that road already in action, but there's nothing separating the ashram from the road. And you can see that Vinayaka temple there. That was already there. And that Mantapam just next to it was already there. In 1953, so we're looking, after Bhagavan's left the body, Chinnaswamy passed away in February of 53. The ashram just fell into a very hard time fell into a very hard time financially. Because no Bhagavan, no Chinnaswamy. The devotees even left, you know. Most devotees saw, oh, it's all over, and they packed up and went away. Now, many of those devotees came back. But in those years in between, when the ashram was kind of neglected, TNV was struggling with court cases and financial issues, all kinds of things. So the Goshala was pretty much depopulated. They weren't able to maintain the Goshala. Even the Veda Patasala had fallen into disuse. And it looked like there was going to be no Goshala, no Veda Patasala. Thanks to Chadwick and others, with help from devotees, everything was reestablished. But in those years, it was a tough time. So here's our original thing. Of course, Bhagavan's bathroom. Remember, Bhagavan used to go to this bathroom in the Goshala. That's probably original, with the original structure, or not long after. Yeah, so look at this. Here's the Burmese wood, how substantial that wood is. And you can see why it was needed, because the building is so large, it needs strong support. And here again, granite hewn stone columns and this metal work. That's really extraordinary when you consider that the most advanced architecture we had in the ashram at that time were grass huts, Actually, that's not true. We had the old hall at that point, and the store, but still, all this kind of really fancy, heavy-duty stuff we didn't have. I don't think we had. Well, maybe we did have some Burmese teak in the old hall at that point as well. Yeah, it could be. Chinnaswamy, you remember, he was going back and forth to Burma to get wood. I think he went more than once. I think he went twice. So here's the entrance. Of course, we didn't mention it, but that became our post office. Bhagavan used to read his mail here, read the ashram mail here. We probably have a photo. Yeah, here we are, right there's a photo. Bhagavan sitting there, he would sit there. And and again, teak doors. Look at the it's large. This is substantial for that time. And again, just there's no cows even. Now, what happened, of course, when the Goshala was established, devotees started donating cows. So the Goshala picked up very quickly. But at the time of the construction, so far as I know, it's just Lakshmi and her calf. The other thing that's impressive about this room, this building, is its size, So I think the length that way is 48 feet. That's pretty big. It's way bigger than the old hall, which is the biggest thing we have at that point. And then here's that grill we mentioned earlier, which again is from a metalwork point of view is substantial for that time, you know. It looks to me like they didn't cut corners, you know, and that's what Bhagavan wanted. So this little area, at least in my time here, I don't know how long it's been like that, but in my time here, the freshest, well, actually sometimes in the winter they're kept there, but either here or there. The newborns, the ones that are just a few days old, they're stationed here. And I guess the reason for that is they will need some kind of special care, and I don't know, but they're isolated. They're kept away from the others. And sometimes these rings inside here are used for newborns. So these are very young calves, as you can see. And we used to keep track of the birth. So when a calf was born, it would be announced, and everybody would say in the ashram, oh, this morning, 4 a.m., a calf was born, or 2 calves were born. We've had even sometimes more than that in a day born, you know. And then here's another, oh, sorry, yeah. I don't blame you. Those are so nice to see. Yeah. This area over here, these are youngsters, but a little older. I don't know at which age they shift them over, but these are also youngsters, obviously. This whole section, actually, and those back there look even slightly older. These are young enough. And some devotees have worried, you know, because we have so many cows. What do you do with a cow when it stops giving milk? Okay, so we have a retirement home for cows called the Samudram Goshala. It's at a piece of ashram land out about maybe 3 kilometers from here. And so we keep our elder cows there, and they have a very nice ground to live in and spend their final days. And we're supposed to have bananas or something to give these guys, and we're coming very, sorry fella, sorry little girl, I don't have anything for you. No, I didn't bring anything. I'm sorry. No, I didn't bring anything for you. No, I didn't. So sorry. So sorry. So back here are the plants for, well, the one is for, for converting manure, cow manure, into methane. It's piped into our dining hall. And the other is for purifying gray water. So I think it's 15,000 liters per day of wastewater. That means gray water means only mildly used. We're not talking about sewage. We're just talking about hand washing or pot washing, that kind of water. And it actually is necessary because little food items, if you wash pots, food items end up going down the drain. Those items need to be separated out. And that wastage is dried in the sun and used as fertilizer, you know. So even that doesn't go to waste. And in that way, that water can be used, not for drinking, of course, but for watering the gardens. And in the rainy season, there's less need. So this plant is not in full operation at rainy season because there's just so much water. Oh, you know what? That section over there is kind of interesting with the haystacks. Do you want to go up there? It's kind of interesting to, they're kind of beautiful. And I've never seen so much hay here as what we have now. I'm not clear the reason for that. Normally we'll just have a couple of these or 3 of these. And if you'll remember, there's some photos of Bhagavan with Lakshmi standing next to a couple of haystacks. That's all I ever saw until this year. And now we must be having a dozen of them. They come in big rolls, which I think is standard Tamil practice. And you stack the rolls in a certain way. Then you put the loose hay over the top so that you get water runoff in the rain. And they stay, it doesn't rot, it doesn't get moist, it doesn't get wet in the rainy season. And there's a whole kind of science, obviously, behind that, how you store hay. But they're quite beautiful. These are the Gir who came to Ramanashram in 1993. And the way I understand it, these were the first Gir to come anywhere around this area, maybe even Tamil Nadu. I mean, they were just not known at that time. And Punita was the first one. She was gifted by a dairy up in Rajasthan and brought here. And these would be her offspring, not perhaps all of them, other Girs followed. But I think we only see here now about, in this pen there's only about maybe a dozen or less. But I think we have more than that. I don't know where they are. I think we have a total of about 40 maybe, 40 Gir. And we have that one baby over there. But they're known to be very, very intelligent, and Punita was known to be very, very intelligent. I would say probably in this Goshala's history, Lakshmi ranks as #1, and Punita probably stands out in memory as being the second most extraordinary of the cows we've had here. And they're known for their high yield of milk and good quality milk. Yeah. Very nutritious milk, you know.